Okay, before I introduce our vice president, I want to say few words of what's happening in Israel. My daughter, who lives in Petah Tikva, my cousins who all live in the Cologne, have all been living largely in shelters the last few days. We're all very sad by all the casualties and nervous about the continuing dangers in the area. We hope for a quick de-escalation of all the rocket attacks and violence in both Israel and Gaza. Okay, next I want to introduce Mindy Reiser. She's our vice president, and she'll introduce Amy Schwartz, who is our president, and also the topic of today's talk. So, Mindy, please take it away.
Okay, I have to unmute myself. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted you're with us. And in some ways, Amy needs no introduction, but I will give her one anyway. She is a woman of many talents, and most of you on the call know that. She is the opinion and book editor of Moment magazine, and as Jerry just told us, the president of the Jewish Studies Center, where she has been teaching on Jewish commentary, Tehillim, Psalms, and literature. Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she covered education, science, and culture. That's quite a portfolio. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary in 1988 and was a 3-time winner of the Newspaper Guild's Bernie Harrison Memorial Award for commentary and criticism. She has also worked at Harper's Magazine, The New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly. There's much more to be said, but I will now turn to Amy, who will first tell us about her extraordinary adventures with Can Robots Be Jewish? Amy.
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, everyone, for signing on. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It's very nice to be home at the Jewish Studies Center to talk about my book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And about my adventures, as Mindy said, editing the column it's drawn from, Moment Magazine's Ask the Rabbis, which we like to say is our attempt to showcase civilized disagreement in a time when it's hard to come by. So Moment Magazine, for those of you who know, comes out 6 times a year in print and also has a healthy online presence. We often are looking for common ground in a variety of ways. And I'm often told that people often say that the Ask the Rabbis column is their favorite part of the magazine, the thing they turn to first. So why is that? Well, the best way to explain it is probably to ask a question, since it's a book of questions and answers. So let me do a thought experiment. Has anyone ever asked you, so can Jews get tattoos? Or, that's too easy, so what do Jews think happens to you after you die? So if you've ever been in the position of fielding one of these questions, you probably answered in the best kind of online fashion that we've learned from our kids. Well, it's very complicated. And it is. Any conversation about what Jews believe about anything is likely to be a pretty long one. So now let's turn it around. Suppose you have a question and you decide, instead of Googling it like any normal person, you're going to put it to 10 different rabbis. You'll get answers, all right. You'll get so many different answers that you'll probably end up with a whole lot of brand new questions. In other words, you'll come away with a dose of a very important kind of specifically Jewish wisdom. So that's our goal in Ask the Rabbis, from which this book is drawn. Every issue of Moment, where, as Mindy said, I'm the opinion and book editor, we try to think of a question that will spark reflection by rabbis and readers alike, and then we put it to a spectrum of rabbis, usually from 10 different denominations. Did you know there were 10 different Jewish denominations? Most people can name 3 or 4. Our rabbis include Humanist, Jewish Renewal, Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, modern Orthodox, regular Orthodox, Sephardic, and Chabad. Sometimes we go on beyond that. There are plenty of other people to the right on the spectrum past Chabad, but sometimes it's hard for us to get them in the feature for reasons I can talk about later. We also feature an independent rabbi who doesn't consider himself part of any denomination. So we ask them to answer the question in 200 words or less. That's hard. 200 words, 200-word answers are not really most rabbis' default mode, but the results are worth the struggle. We've asked the rabbis all kinds of questions over the years. We've asked them the tattoo question that I started with, and we've asked them the afterlife question. Spoiler, there is no definitive answer to what Jews believe on either of those questions. We've asked the rabbis to apply Jewish principles to contemporary problems that are definitely not mentioned in the Torah. For instance, what does Jewish tradition think about organ donation or editing your children's genes? We've asked the rabbis if Jewish tradition offers any guidance for battling drug addiction or dealing with single parenthood or coming out as transgender. We've asked them, are Jews still expecting a Messiah? We've asked them about current events. Does Jewish law forbid racism? Is silence consent? And a favorite of mine, are we commanded to vote? And of course, we have asked them, can a robot be Jewish? Naturally, on all these questions, there's a lot of disagreement. Sometimes, as you'd expect, the liberal rabbis disagree with the Chabad rabbis. But sometimes, the rabbis at the two ends of the spectrum agree with each other, but disagree with the ones in the middle. Sometimes they all agree, but give different reasons and cite different texts. So the rabbis are, I think the rabbis are a fabulous array. Some of them I've worked with over the years. Some of them rotate. But so at one end, for instance, we have the humanist rabbis who go out of their way in virtually every answer to emphasize that they do not, as humanist Jews, believe in God or any supernatural being. It's sort of their brand. As a humanist Jew, I certainly don't want anyone to think I believe X, Y, or Z. At the other end, you have Orthodox and Hasidic rabbis who won't spell out the name of God because it's too holy. They'll spell it, G-D, a familiar practice, I think a practice familiar to all of us, to echo the practice in Hebrew of avoiding the pronouncement of the divine name. So that would, again, so far so good, right? That seems like a straightforward contrast. But then we have the renewal rabbis, some of whom resonate to the emotional and spiritual practices of Hasidism. And some of them have taken to spelling God, G !D. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I love this innovation. I think it's really interesting and creative, and it looks kind of cool on the page. But I've had to fight to get it past Moment's proofreaders, to whom it is deeply distressing. In fact, one of the first big arguments I won when I first came on as opinion editor was with the proofreader who said that we had to have a magazine form for God. God had to be spelled the same way all the time because that's how magazines work. And I had to convince her that the whole point of this feature was that you could spell God any way you liked. Even rabbis just didn't agree. So other denominations may have their signature moves, their tells. The Reconstructionist rabbis, at least the ones we use, seem to take every opportunity to quote Abraham Joshua Heschel. For the Lubavitchers, of course, it's the Lubavitcher Rebbe. When they can, they'll quote the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The conservative rabbi, I always tease, she invariably recommends further reading. So what's our point with all this? Are we trying to play like Rabbi Gotcha? Are we trying to make them look silly? No, of course not. Partly, we thought that doing this juxtaposition in this feature would be a way to make accessible to a lay reader the rich debates that have raged throughout Jewish tradition and still rage today. But there's a deeper reason too, and it's actually kind of important, especially now. And to explain, I have to take you back to a familiar and beloved scene from Fiddler on the Roof. So in this scene, Tevye is trying to mediate a dispute between a conservative villager and a young radical, Perchik, who's just gotten off the train in town. You remember, later he becomes Tevye's son-in-law and goes to Siberia. So this is his first appearance. The villager says something like, "Who cares what they think in Kiev?" And Tevye says, "Yeah, he's right." And Perchik volleys back, "What do you mean, who cares? How can you ignore what everyone thinks other than yourself?" And Tevye says, "Yeah, he's right." And a third villager interrupts and says, He's right and he's right. How can they both be right? And Tevye considers this, and then he says, you're also right. So to me, it's all there in that one exchange, and I had it constantly in mind when I was editing this book. It's the Jewish love of argument and the fundamental Jewish ethic of tolerance for differing views. These are the two values that animate this collection and really the whole landscape of Jewish religious insight that we're trying to capture. I don't have to tell anybody here that this principle of tolerance for argument, the idea that someone who disagrees with you might not be your enemy, has been unpopular of late, but it's deeply, deeply Jewish, and it predates Tevye by millennia. Argument in Judaism is not just a positive value, it's actually considered in many sources a mode of worship. Multiple opinions are given, text study is done in pairs, the better to thrash out questions as they arise, and dispute is accompanied by respect. The most common description of this in the Talmud recounts a debate between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and reports that a heavenly voice ends the argument by saying, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, these and these are the words of the living God. The heavenly voice then rules in Hillel's favor, but the reference to these and these, Elu ve'elu, is cited approvingly throughout the entire tradition, in one case with the added comment, this is a principle for all of Torah. Today, this principle continues to set the stage for an unchecked drama. We see it in the pages of Talmud, in study sessions on Zoom. Interpreters of Jewish life and tradition are arguing in the spirit of worship. And if tolerance of another person's opinion seems to be a receding ideal, it remains an ideal for which we strive. So having planted my flag on dispute, let me tell you a little bit more specific about the book. The book is a selection of 30 of our favorite questions and answers from over the 15 years we've been running the feature. That's only about a fifth of them. I've been editing the feature for 10 years, and it's been in existence for 15 years. It was invented by my editor-in-chief, Nadine Epstein, when she took over the editing of Moment. There are 6 sections in the book, 6 chapters. They're organized under science, sex, modern life, politics, values, and the nature of the universe. Each one has questions from across the 15-year period so that the changing contexts of these questions and answers, whether social, political, or scientific, becomes part of the story. So the most dramatic and yet predictable pattern of disagreement is, of course, these left-right spectrums that I mentioned at the outset. It does sometimes happen. For instance, in the question I started with, can Jews get tattoos? Or as we phrased it, we asked them actually, are tattoos and body piercings taboo? So this was an early question. It was asked in 2008. Not only do the rabbis in this case disagree along a spectrum, but it comes out very neatly. Each one does so in a sort of a characteristic way that tells you something about the way that denomination approaches things. At least so I like to think. So on tattoos, the one thing all the rabbis agreed on, from independent to Chabad, was no, having a tattoo will not bar you from being buried in a Jewish cemetery, no matter what your Hebrew school teacher told you. That is not true. But that's about all they do agree on. Here, I'll read you a couple of excerpts, snippets from across the board. Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, the humanist, says tattoos should be, quote, entirely an individual matter. That's clear enough. The renewal rabbi, Laura Dwan Kaplan in this case, says Torah clearly forbids tattooing and self-cutting as ways of mourning or memorializing. However, Torah also implies that piercings can be opportunities for good or bad. The Israelite men donated their earrings to build the golden calf, but the Israelite women donated theirs to build the Mishkan, the sanctuary. So that seems very renewal to me. You can squeeze all these different meanings out of any action. The conservative rabbi, Julie Schoenfeld, says, to characterize the issue to young people as taboo misses a crucial opportunity to convey Jewish affirmations of the fundamental dignity of the human being. The conservative position on tattooing states that while we discourage the practice, no sanctions are imposed. That's the conservative movement for you, right? All about the teachable moment. We'll tell you what to do, but we will not enforce it. The Sephardic rabbi, moving on to the right, Joshua Maruf, embraces the prohibition, and he talks about why. He says, and I don't think the other rabbis would disagree with him on the actual argument, he says, tattoos are indeed forbidden by the Torah the human body is a wondrous manifestation of God's master design. Hijacking the body and transforming it into an artistic canvas or a vehicle for expression distorts these fundamental principles and leads us to believe we can cast aside the divine image and fashion ourselves after the image of our choice. The Chabad rabbi simply says, tattoos are not kosher. The laws are detailed in the Shulchan Aruch and in Rambam under idolatry. Period. So that's, as I said, that's sort of a classic, but you don't see it quite that way too often. A more complicated pattern emerged from what I think was the very first question that was asked when we started this feature, and it was, wait for it, should Jewish children sing Christmas carols? This was a burning question at the time. I'm not sure it would be answered quite the same way today, but you never know. Anyway, here, too, answers reflected the whole range from absolutely not to sure, why not? And in between, you had a nice selection of, well, it depends, this, it depends, that. But none of these things were quite what met the eye. The Humanist Rabbi was on sure, why not? But, so in fact, he concluded by saying, if a nice Jewish boy named Erling Berlin can write White Christmas, other Jewish boys and girls ought to be able to sing it. But this was only after he admitted to his own discomfort on a caroling expedition he had had as a teenager and contrasting it to his wife, who had found it a fun intercultural experience. So he basically says, I don't see anything wrong with it, but, you know, check your kishkas, which, again, you wouldn't really necessarily expect of that end of the spectrum. So the most emphatic no of the entire panel came from the conservative rabbi, you'd think right in the middle, Sherry Hirsch, who declared, the answer is simply no, Jewish children should not participate in Christmas caroling. And the Chabad rabbi in this case, Rabbi Yosef Jacobson, left things a little bit complex. He framed the question in the, he didn't like the idea, but he framed the question in the wider context of American Jews' navigation of multiple identities. And he told the old joke, I say it's a joke, I've heard it told as true, but it's surely apocryphal, about Henry Kissinger, who supposedly wrote a letter to Golda Meir in which he informed her that he was sorry, but first, he was an American citizen, second, he was Secretary of State, and third, he was a Jew. And Golda, as you may recall if you've heard this, responded, that's all right, this doesn't bother me. In Israel, we read from right to left. So another, so even for the Chabad rabbi, there's room for, I shouldn't say even, I mean, all the rabbis are very nuanced is the point. So another very different but still somewhat classic pattern is the afterlife question, which I also mentioned at the outset, in which not only do the rabbis disagree on whether there is an afterlife, they also disagree on whether Jews think there is an afterlife. The independent rabbi says, some Jews do, some Jews don't. The humanist says, most people I know believe that this is the only life we'll ever know, yet this doesn't negate the idea of an afterlife. The Reconstructionist says, congregants asking about an afterlife are mostly seeking reassurance that a loved one is not entirely gone. So then she goes on to talk about, ways to remember and to memorialize. The conservative rabbi says, simply put, yes, Judaism assumes there is a world beyond this world. When I speak with students or congregants, I like to explain there is life after life, but we cannot know exactly what it consists of because our human understanding is limited. She then recommends further reading. The Orthodox rabbi says, belief in an afterlife, a world to come in which the righteous get their true reward and the wicked get their deserved comeuppance, is a central teaching of traditional Judaism. The Sephardic rabbi, who you'd think would be part of traditional Judaism, says, there is little doubt that Jews in biblical times subscribed to a belief in some kind of life after death. And a rabbi whose name you may know, Shmuley Boteach, who was then with Chabad, but later actually was kicked out of that denomination, but it's a long story, says, consistent with its this world orientation, Judaism does believe in an afterlife, but remarkably, it is here on this earth. In other words, he's talking about the world to come being, a time here on earth rather than a place. So as one of the rabbis says, this kind of confusion is to be expected for a question in which, by the time we know for sure, it's too late to tell. So one last pattern I'll mention before we get to the conversation part of this, and this was one of my personal favorites, emerges from the answers to a question we asked in 2014. What does the Torah teach us about addiction? And the reason I like this question is because obviously the Torah says nothing explicitly about drug addiction. It's all about where do you see a parallel, where do you see a metaphor. But watch what the rabbis do with it. So Gershon Winkler, our independent rabbi, this is a rabbi who I think he runs something called the Walking Stick Foundation. He used to take people walking in the California mountains and tell them about Jewish texts. So an interesting, like really a denomination that at the time he sort of had invented. I think there are other wilderness rabbis now. So anyway, he starts by drawing a lesson about addiction from the story of the golden calf. On Sinai, he says, we got so caught up in our subjective assumptions about God that we carved out and worshipped an image that reflected those assumptions. He goes on to say, addiction is the act of replacing a truth or a need or an innate desire with an artificial facsimile that eventually supersedes that truth. You have to be melted down, he says, like the idol, to escape the addiction that comes from that kind of self-regard once you've created something and you think it's the real thing. Rabbi Schweitzer, the humanist, turns to Cain and Abel. He says one of his favorite passages is Genesis chapter 4, where God has accepted Abel's offering, but rejected the one from Cain. Yet he points out God doesn't give up on Cain. He offers him straight talk. He says, why are you angry? If you don't do what is good, sin is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it. The rabbi adds, temptation is there. It's always ready to pounce, always ready to snare us. So we say the wrong word, or waste time, or self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, or too much junk food. But we can also be master over it, not because we resort to prayer or turn to a higher power to pull us through. That is not what God says to Cain, but because we can take charge of our own actions. The first step is acknowledging our human nature. So Rabbi Katz, then the conservative rabbi, like the independent, looks to Exodus, but she's not looking at the golden calf. She says, the journey of the Israelites from Egypt, their narrow place, is a depiction of the journey from addiction to recovery. They backslide, they struggle to start again, they fall, they get up, they continue on. And some other rabbis also pair up in surprising ways in the texts they choose. The Jewish renewal rabbi, in this case a Goldie Milgram, talks about Shabbat as a rebuke to addiction, to work or anything else, anything you can't step away from. She says the penalty for work addiction, for working more than 6 days a week, she notes rather ominously, in the Torah was stoning. The modern Orthodox rabbi, Yitz Greenberg, he's one of our stars. He's a very significant figure in modern Orthodoxy and in general. He also mentions work addiction as the kind of addiction, and he talks about Shabbat also, although he doesn't mention stoning. Shabbat, he says, is there, among other things, to show that there's actually nothing in our lives that we're so attached to that we can't take a 24-hour break from. So the Reform rabbi, Sari Laufer, who's in LA now, takes as her starting point the story of Noah. People may have thought of this right away, who emerging from the ark after the flood and seeing the destruction of the whole world immediately drinks himself into oblivion. This same scene is what comes to mind for the Chabad rabbi, Shais Taub, who starts by saying, Noah was not out to have a good time. He was on a mission to blot out self-consciousness. And Rabbi Taub, whom I actually had reached out to in this case because I knew he had written a book about addiction, goes on to write very movingly of what he calls, quote, the pain of self-awareness on the one hand and of self-obliteration on the other. And he concludes that addiction is but the human condition writ large. We're only happy once we get over ourselves. And that is recovery from addiction, when I realize that the only way I can truly function is through extreme selflessness and surrender to a power greater than myself. Note that he ends at a position exactly 180 degrees opposed to the humanist who emphasizes that surrendering to a higher power is the last thing God wants from Cain. And yet, if I had to characterize these disagreements, these two in particular, I would say they are expressing closely related insights. And not only that, but they're doing it in a shared vocabulary that encompasses both. Even when there seems to be a complete switch in perspective, they somehow end up conveying different versions of the same sensibility of the cowering human being, plucking up his internal resources before the void. So I would go on and on, but there's no reason to. I would just say that there have been many, many other surprises of this kind. I've been editing this feature for a decade, and the rabbi's answers never fail to amaze me. Did you know, for instance, perhaps you know, there's a pretty well-educated crowd, that the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein may very well have been the Jewish folktale of the Golem. Somebody pointed that out in the Can Robots Be Jewish feature. Or did you know that the rabbis of the Talmud, going back to the 2nd century CE, recognized up to 5 different genders? So you can read right through this book. This is the sales pitch, or you can browse and look things up in it, and you'll learn just as much from the disagreements as from the occasional agreements. Whether you personally agree or disagree, every answer will teach you something. And together, we hope, they'll give you a glimpse into a vast treasure trove of Jewish argument and Jewish wisdom. Mindy?
Yes, Amy.
Ready to be questioned.
All right, Amy, we've already gotten some fine questions from 3 people.
Okay.
And they're looking at some of the logistics and some of the organizational arrangements. So Lisa Sackett is interested in how are the questions developed? Is it a committee process? Is it from the thought of Amy? Is it both? So enlighten us.
So it's a very good question, and in general, I would say that the questions emerge from the editorial meeting. We like to we sit down and we kick around what we think people would be. We're a print magazine, so we have a delay. So in September, we're thinking about what people will be thinking about in November, and so you can't always. Sometimes you can peg to a holiday, but generally not really. We all start with a lot of questions we ourselves have about Judaism, and we try, I think when Nadine Epstein, the editor, launched this, she had a bunch of questions of her own, and some of the best questions just came from her back file. Like, I always wondered, right now, we were in the middle of developing a question for the issue that's coming out in June, July, and she said, I've been wondering about evil. What does Judaism think about absolute evil? She just always wondered it. So, but the question, to have a really good question, you have to, we try, first of all, to ask questions that don't have like one easy answer. Like, you don't want a question to which the answer is straightforward or technical. Like, how do you know when it's time to start Shabbat? Everyone would just answer the same thing and it wouldn't be interesting. And you don't want a question and you don't want a question on which there isn't a lot of disagreement, or on which all the rabbis will feel they have to say the same thing. Of course that's a terrible thing, whatever it is. So a good question is just open-ended enough to allow for a certain amount of variation, whatever you want to call it, but also pointed enough so that they'll squirm a little bit. They'll have to really think about it. I particularly often, with a good question, I'll get a phone call from one of the rabbis who will basically say, "What?" And we think those are the best questions, when they're like, "What do you want? What are you talking about?" And then we'll kind of think it through with them and help them well, we thought this would be interesting because X, and we don't know about this, whatever.
Yeah, that gets to a question that's of interest to several people, in terms of, are there taboos in terms of the questions you won't even ask, that are just pushing too far? And have rabbis said, I cannot answer this. This is not something I want to take up. What are the lines that some people just won't cross?
So that's also a good question. So I can't think of a question we backed off asking because it was too hard. I mean, we like them hard. We like the questions too, and we want to make the rabbis not exactly uncomfortable, but we like to make them work a little bit. And they generally they've insofar as I get feedback, they like that kind of question. They like questions that really make them think and maybe push them a little. There are occasionally rabbis who would rather not answer a question that they see as too political. I think only one of the rabbis declined to answer the question about absolute evil this time, and so we have multiple rabbis in all the denominations, and so sometimes I just guess wrong about what someone will want to answer. I will tell that I do have one story about a question where a rabbi didn't want to answer, and this was when we asked a question about contraception. I think this was in 2014, something like that, and it was a very open-ended question. What does does Judaism have any guidance on contraception, something like that. Let me see if I can find the exact wording. It was very neutral. Does Jewish law or tradition offer any guidance on contraception? Because, some of the other religions are very clear on what they think of contraception one way or another. And so it seemed like interesting that it turns out Judaism is really not like that at all, as most of the answers were similar. Not in terms of how people behave, but in terms of what the commandment is, the basic commandment. All of them agreed, even the most orthodox. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply is not on the woman because that could endanger her life. It's on the man, and there are certain. It's in tension with it's in some equipoise with other values about preserving life and things like that. And so in general we got a good range of answers, and some of them are very specific. Well, halacha says these are okay but these aren't okay. The IOD is okay under certain circumstances but not a condom. So when I reached, I sometimes, when I don't have a specific Chabad rabbi in mind, I do. At this point I know a lot of them. I know a lot of them personally, but when I don't, I'll call a rabbi who's sort of in charge of, he works with Moment, and he'll find me a rabbi who can answer a specific question if I can't do it, if I can't find one. And so I sent him the question, and he called me for the first time ever in our interaction. He picked up the phone and he called me and he said, "Look, we don't think this question should be answered by a man. We think a woman should address this question." And I said, "Well, this is he says, we have some women who could address this question very, 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 very well, with a lot of, very, very knowledgeably." So I said, "Well, this is a rabbis panel. It's supposed to be all rabbis. That's the point of the feature." And he said, "I promise you, these women I'm talking about, they're just as good as rabbis." And so I said, I did not say I did not say, "Well, that's not my problem, that's your problem." I didn't say, I like him. I didn't say anything like that. But I said, "Well, I don't think so. Why don't you see what you can do in terms of getting a rabbi? It's okay to have a rabbi answer this." So he right before deadline, he sent me an email saying, "We just can't do it. I'm sure you understand." And so, and it's in the book. There's a note to that effect. There just wasn't a Chabad entry in that case. And I never figured out, it was one of two things. Either they didn't want an answer that seemed, either the answer was lenient and they didn't want to be attached in public to a lenient answer, or the answer was really stringent from their point of view and they didn't want to be associated in public with a really stringent answer because they didn't want to come across as really, really stringent, because, Chabad has a certain amount of, they're very sophisticated in how they come across. So anyway, so that's my one story about a rabbi actually being unable to answer a question.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions, and there's real interest in how the rabbis are selected in the first instance. I know you've alluded to that, but a little bit more specificity. And are rabbis approaching you or Nadine and say, "I want to be part of this," and how do you handle that? And then also, can readers send you or Nadine questions that they'd like you to pose?
So the easiest question, of course, is the last one. That happens all the time. In fact, I've picked up a wonderful selection of questions just from doing talks for this book. Is people have come up with the best questions. I really wish we could ask, "Are cicadas kosher?" because someone asked me that in the last book talk. But as far as picking the rabbis, I mean, I should say this is not intended as a sociological, a scholarly cross-section of the American rabbinate. It's just journalism. So when I came into the job, I inherited a bunch of regulars, some of them extremely good and distinguished, and we're lucky to have them, like Itz Greenberg, and others who, this is not that easy to do on a regular basis. It's actually quite tricky to get something really, really pithy in 200 words and get a lot of Jewish content as opposed to just your opinion. And we do often have people approach us, or maybe a board member will approach us and say, "I know this wonderful rabbi, he really wants to do an Ask the Rabbis." And sometimes we'll add these people into the rotation. Most of the denominations rotate a little bit. Some of them are always the same rabbi, but most of them rotate to varying degrees. Not all rabbis can really pull this off. I mean, not all of them really understand what we're looking for. It's so easy to just write a little tiny, like a little op-ed piece, like you think it's your chance to write a really funny, snarky letter to the editor about an issue, but that's really not what we're looking for. So I'm always on the lookout for new rabbis, and we even also in some cases add in new denominations when it comes up. Yitz Greenberg and I did a talk on, a conversation like this a couple of maybe 2 months ago, must be more than that because I hadn't broken my leg yet. And he said, why don't you use one of the Maharats from the open Orthodox lane? And so maybe we'll add that. For a long time, we were constrained by the layout because we could only have one double spread, and you just can't go above 2,000 words in a spread and have room for art. And so we couldn't go above 10 rabbis. But now it's a little more, we've opened it out a little bit. And so, sky's the limit. Oh, the other thing is when we have a question that's really specific, sometimes we'll reach out to a rabbi with expertise, like in the gene editing question. There are rabbi, doctor, scientists, and there's even I think it's the Reform Movement has a project called Sinai and Synapses, which is all about like Torah and brain science. So there are a lot of very, very knowledgeable rabbis on specific subjects. And that goes through all the different denominations. There are 61 different rabbis in this book, so it's pretty good.
Okay. Somebody actually asked about Rebbitzins, but Rebbitzins are not Maharats. And what have you been guided to with regard to reaching out to women from the Orthodox community who are not called rabbis, but essentially are?
Well, as I said, it's not a new phenomenon, but until recently, I mean, we have most of the people at that end are regulars. Yitz is a regular. Rabbi Adlerstein, who's our Orthodox rabbi, has been a regular, and I hadn't thought of adding a third Orthodox lane until recently, but absolutely, we are inclined to do that, and we'll probably start reaching out pretty soon.
Now, you've indicated that this is not a sociological study, but I'm going to ask you those kind of questions, and you can say, I don't want to answer. Over the 10 years you've been editing this feature, are you seeing any shifts, either in the kind of sources indicated, or the way assertions are articulated, or questions back to you that you might not have been asked before? What has a decade meant? Okay.
Not as much as you'd think. I mean, all my answers to this sort of come up in the negative. For instance, there are some questions in here that I really, when I was collecting questions for the book, I saw we'd asked a question about single parenthood, for instance, before my time, like in 2009, I think, something like that. And the question was something like, what should our attitude be towards unmarried single mothers? And I thought, we wouldn't even ask that now, and we probably wouldn't, honestly. But when I read through it, I saw that the sentiments expressed, or the views expressed, I should say, were entirely contemporary. I mean, the vocabulary might have been slightly shifted from how we would have said things earlier, but the take on it was entirely across the board, liberal, to say, to use it in the more conversational sense. There was the overarching value that I picked up from all of these different rabbis of whatever denomination was the need to keep people inside the community as opposed to, expelling them in shame. And so there was always, the Orthodox rabbis would say, well, this obviously isn't optimal, but we here are the ways that it can be fine. And, halachically, a child born to, I thought this was sort of interesting, halachically, a child born to unmarried parents who could marry has no negative status. He's not a mamzer if his parents are both Jews and they're eligible to marry. Doesn't affect the child, which I didn't know, and that might not even be universally agreed on, but that was the citation. So there were a couple of examples like that. I'll tell you, there's only one question. It's not in the book, and every so often Moment will put up an old question if it's about a holiday or something. And we have this one question that we asked way, way before my time about whether Jewish children should go trick-or-treating. When I read it, they every so often they would put it up, and I finally said, don't put that up anymore. It's so, you would never argue it in those terms. There was all these negative terms about the surrounding culture and intermarriage. And it's just, in that sense, I think the discussion, or the terms of discussion, have shifted, and there's less of an inclination to use highly judgmental language, at least across most of the spectrum. But even on the right, because there's much more emphasis on sort of inclusion and bringing people back, or reading them in rather than reading them out. So that would be the main thing I've heard.
That's interesting, and that kind of encompasses a very thoughtful question by Maya Bernstein. Do the rabbis feel like they are representing their whole movement, or their own selves, and what kind of questions they might ask you with that regard?
So my view of this is that no rabbi, the rabbis are generally educated and maybe constrained halachically by what denomination they're part of, but their views are their own. That's the nice thing about Judaism. You could probably do a whole feature of this with just 10 conservative rabbis, and they'd probably more or less, they wouldn't disagree as much as this, but I'm sure they would all have different views. Again, I think as you go, it's possible that I sometimes wonder if the Chabad people are submitting the answers to a central authority before they give them to me. But probably not really. But generally, I don't think so. That's the thing about Judaism, is rabbis are decisors. They get to say what they think. That's the argument, obviously, for rotating, because people will sometimes say, oh, you use this one conservative rabbi so much, wouldn't it be better? There's such a huge range, and so many brilliant people, and wouldn't it be better to rotate a little bit? So we try, but then we love our regulars, and they're very, very reliable, and they do it for love.
Okay, let me ask this again. Some of this you won't get an answer to, but have the rabbis said that this has influenced me in any way, being part of this? Someone wants to know if the rabbis get to read each other's responses before you publish it. And do you think there have been debates that have erupted because of the various comments rabbis have given to specific questions?
We do not let them see each other's answers before they're published, but as soon as they're published, we send out the link and say, please put this up everywhere. And they're always, I think, I get the impression they're always extremely interested to see what everybody else said and where it all turned out. The same reason I'm interested. It's endlessly interesting, these patterns that form. And I'm always, when I'm editing it, I'm always down in the weeds. And then when I pull back and I send the whole feature out to the magazine, people start writing back to me and saying, that's really interesting. And then I look at it and it's like, oh yeah, it is interesting. So I don't know for sure of any case where any rabbis have gotten in trouble for something they've written. There's some denominations where we've had some turnover, where like we have a rabbi, he did this for a while, he'd lose his job, his replacement would do it for a while, he'd lose his job. But I don't think that's us. I think anyone who's willing to write things for us that might get them in trouble is also widely speaking and publishing and saying whatever they like, in a lot of other places too. So I don't think we'd be the tipping point for any rabbi. We did have we had a problem. There was a problem years ago with a rabbi who answered a question about Jewish-Arab relations. This was very time linked, and so it didn't go in the book. It dated, but he said something that people thought was a little bloodthirsty. He quoted from sort of the Amalekite thing. You have to kill not only the people but also their cattle. And we got a lot of letters about that. And apparently he got threats. And a lot of people think that that's why he stopped writing for the magazine, but it's not true at all. I won't name him because why drag all this up? But he continued for quite a while after that. He's still a friend of the house. And in fact, I sent him a note when this came out, because he's in it on some other subject, and said, do you want a copy? And he sent back just the loveliest note. So I don't think this has caused anyone to get in really serious trouble.
Okay. In terms of the sources, there obviously are classic sources like the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch and a whole lot of other things. Have you found unusual sources that the rabbis are citing as kind of assertions of the views that they are stating, that this shows how crucial this is? Any surprises there on what's included as documentation?
I mean, not really. I mean, some of the rabbis just have a very deep knowledge of sources, and our independent Rabbi Winkler comes up with a lot of very surprising sources, but they're perfectly legit. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff in the Talmud. There's a lot of stuff in all the sources. We do fact check. We check all the citations. We have. I couldn't do it myself, but a couple of our staffers are Jewishly, have a yeshiva education and have no problem with it. And just, it's been lovely lately. Not only can they just look in Sepharia, which is this wonderful online, archive of text, but we now, if you read this feature online, we link to Sepharia when the rabbis quote. So people have, that we just started doing that a couple of months ago, and people really like that. So no, I mean, the sources are in general legit. That was one of these rabbis I was talking about that really wanted to be part of Ask the Rabbis and just couldn't get the hang of it. Like, he kept sending me stuff that didn't have any Jewish content. And when I said, look, how about some sources? He sent me something with a quote from George Washington's letter about the vine and the fig tree. And I was like, no, that's not really what we're talking about. So,
yeah, again, in terms of the pool of people, someone wants to know if you would reach out to a messianic rabbi.
No, I don't consider those people Jews. But that's just editorial policy. I mean, we're just talking about Jews. I mean, we do have the magazine also has a feature. It used to be called Symposium. Now it's called The Big Questions. And in those, we ask a question and we cast a much wider swath, and we'll often use people from a variety of religions and other backgrounds, scholars and philosophers and artists. We had one in the current issue has one called What is the Meaning of Community Today, for instance. And we had one a couple of years ago, What is the Meaning of God Today? And for those, you just do, you can ask, you don't need to confine yourself to Jews, let alone rabbis. But this is, this has its own identity. And it's, I feel like we have to keep it firm, just so otherwise you'd go all over the place.
Yeah, you've alluded to this before, but given where we are this evening and Jerry's earlier comments, what kind of questions have you asked, or have you deliberately not asked too much about relationships with the current developments in Israel and how this might affect perceptions of Jewish obligations toward Israel, or Jewish responses to particular policies? Or is this veering in another direction?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. No, we do ask Israel questions. I just didn't put any in the book. And the reason I was actually the most surprised of anybody when I finished the manuscript and realized that there was hardly a reference to Israel in it. And the reason is because we're hoping this book will be around for a long time, and we didn't put in any questions that were pegged specifically to news developments. And most of the questions, it's not that the questions themselves are pegged to news developments, it's just that people answer them in very specific ways. We asked, I'm trying to think of, we have a different feature. We had a moment debate. We asked if Jews should criticize Israel. Oh, we asked the rabbis, for instance, we asked them about BDS. They talk about BDS from the pulpit. And we got a lot of really interesting answers, but they were really specific to that time and place and to what was going on. And it was a couple of years ago, and it just didn't read like something that would still be true 10, 15 years from now. We've asked a bunch of questions about Jews and Muslims, about Jews and Syrian refugees, and they're just very very news oriented. It's a good challenge. I mean, it would be a good thing to ask a question about Israel that was more sort of general. It's not that we're shying away from it. We love, like I say, we like to stir things out.
I know that. Okay. You kind of alluded to this too, but I'll ask it again on behalf of Maya Bernstein. And Maya, thank you for your several questions. We have a couple of people who've been sending in several questions. Does Judaism say anything about our behavior in a pandemic?
It's funny, like this is where I always look for the point where I can say, I'm not a rabbi, I just play one on Zoom. But I just did a piece for a different part of the magazine on pikuach nefesh, which is the Jewish principle that saving a life comes before almost any other commandment. And I think if you were to look at the Jewish approach to behavior during a pandemic, that's the place people usually start with. I mean, that's the, you know, you're weighing that against other things, but essentially you're talking about, you know, anything that threatens the safety of other human beings in the community or in general is something you would shy away from, even if it, you know, that's why even the most orthodox denominations at the outset told people to stay home, don't go to synagogue for Yom Kippur, don't have seders. And, you know, after a while, obviously there's been drift and seepage and whatever you want to call it, away from that position. But that, if you're looking at the sort of the general approach, I think that might be a starting point. But again, we asked a lot of questions about virtual Judaism, but we haven't asked any specifically about you know, vaccines or anything like that. Again, we should have, like, vaccine is an obvious question to ask, but we were actually afraid that it was moving too fast. We've never felt that we could be sure that 6 weeks from the time we asked the question, when the magazine came out, it would still, you know, we'd still have the same fact base to work from.
Some of our knowledgeable listeners here tell us about Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who has, quote, great stuff on Jews' obligation to get vaccinated. Do you know anything about this?
That sounds about right. He's on the law committee.
Yeah.
Has been a long time, I think. No, there are a lot of, as I said, I did this piece, I think it's not in the current issue, it's in the last issue, on pikuach nefesh, and all the rabbis that I talked to were very good on the obligation to get vaccinated and the obligation in general to follow public health things. I haven't seen Elliot Dorff specifically on vaccination. At this point, it's starting to look like we might want to ask a question about vaccination, because positions seem to have hardened to the point where we can't count on it being overtaken by events. So that's a sad thing, but maybe it would make for a good question. Again,
somewhat related obliquely to what you said before about contraception, although off somewhat differently. Discussion about Me Too issues, how these have or have not been taken up, and maybe women rabbis might have a somewhat different approach to these questions.
Well, most of these, I mean, certainly easily half of the rabbis in this book are women. It's beyond outreach on specific questions. I mean, you know, when we had a trans question, I looked for a trans rabbi, but for questions about women, I didn't have to look for women rabbis. You know, the Reform and the conservative regulars are both women of great seniority and you know, insight, and a lot of the renewal rabbis are women. A lot of the one of the humanist rabbis is a woman. So it's, you know, it's not really a problem. I don't think that's really a problem, but we did ask, the question in the book that's about Me Too, which was asked in 2020, I guess. No, 2018, what was the big year for? Anyway, we asked, is silence consent? And we were trying to capture, we thought we didn't want to ask something really narrow about what was going on. We wanted something that would make people bring different aspects of the idea. So the question was, you know, is it complicit to stand by? There was is silence, you know, so you had all these different answers, not all of which were specifically about Me Too, but many of which were. For instance, one of the rabbis brought up the shalom bayit, the idea that when women would, you know, complain of domestic abuse, the rabbis would say, what's important is peace in the house. Shalom bayis, go home and make up with your husband because it's your job to keep peace in the house. So that's not halacha, but it certainly was a very strong custom. And there's the silence of the bride under the chuppah in Orthodoxy. Her silence is presumed to be consent, and that's sort of problematic. And Gila Langner, who many of us know, actually she's a former president of the Study Center. She's also a renewal rabbi. She had a very interesting meditation on that. Well, what does it mean to be silent and for that to be presumed to be your consent? What does that imply about women's voices at that time? And the some of the more Orthodox rabbis, Levi Shem Tov, who was writing our Chabad, answered that time, said, a misplaced silence, according to tradition, was the reason the temple fell. People standing by and allowing a guest to be shamed. I don't know how many people know this midrash. It's a very interesting passage. It's about a Roman incident which involves mistaken identity, and a guest goes to a party where he's not welcome, and he's shamed and sent out, and then afterwards he goes to the Romans and spreads a malevolent rumor, and one thing leads to another, and the end result of it is that Jerusalem falls and there's no temple. And this is a lesson you hear some rabbis teach. It's not in the answer. It's not in the answer at full length, but it's the idea is causeless hatred, sinat chinam, between Jews is the most dangerous thing. And so anyway, so that was one question we asked about Me Too. And then we asked another question which was sort of relevant to it, although not directly, and that is not in the book. We asked, how would you as a rabbi counsel a sexual predator? Which that was one where a lot of people passed me along to rabbis who had more direct experience in this area, like a lot of rabbis who do this kind of pastoral work were willing to reflect on it, and others. I had never asked a question to which so many rabbis answered, I don't know enough to talk about this. They still did, but they would start by saying they didn't know. So anyway, there are many, many questions you can ask about these. You can always keep circling back to these issues.
Okay, we're getting close to where we're going to get some final words here. But before that, what was the most provocative set of questions that you asked that you got the largest response from the readers, where you got a kind of a torrent of mail? Or can't you really say there was one particular set of questions?
I can't think of anything offhand. We got a lot of very enthusiastic joining in. We asked a question about what sins should we atone for in our use of social media. That's in the book. And everyone loved that question. Everyone had an answer. In fact, I was just flipping through earlier and I was thinking I would read, if I just wanted a feel-good answer, Rabbi Winkler answered the question as follows. This is a couple years ago, but some things don't change so much. He said, "Oh, Master of the Universe, on this Yom Kippur, please forgive me for the sin of neglecting the cholent pot and allowing it to boil over and become encrusted due to my obsessive checking and rechecking of Facebook. For the sin of not having heard my partner whisper I love you because I was listening to some rant on YouTube. For the sin of believing every libelous tirade posted on Instagram as if it had come down from Sinai. For the sin of spending hours hypnotically glommed onto Facebook Messenger while texting the person seated beside me." And then he goes on through several more. And in the end, he's for the sin of awakening envy and disdain in others by sending photos and tweets about how absolutely wonderful my life is. And for the sin of allowing social media to transform me into a mesmerized worshiper of screens illuminated by light-emitting diodes while I waste away in the back seat of my self-driving car.
Wow.
So I don't know. And in some ways that almost loops us back to, can robots be Jewish? So if anyone actually, before we finish, wants to talk about whether robots can be Jewish, that's an opening. But if people have other questions, that's also fine.
Okay. Someone asks, will there be a sequel to this book? Because the questions go on and the answers go on as well. So are you thinking about volume 2?
I will say from your mouth to God's ears, as they say. We would love to do a sequel, and we're hoping this one will we're hoping this one will do well, like in Hebrew schools and things like that, in addition to regular readers, because it's, we like to think it's a good resource. So
I think that we have a bit of time for people to ask questions in their own words, in their own voice, rather than have me kind of be the mediator here. So if any of you want to do a thumbs up sign, or if you want to raise your hand, because I can see some of you on the screen here. Maybe Jerry would like to pose a question. He's been quiet, which is not his usual stance. Jerry?
I don't have any questions at this point, but I will tell people that there is in the bottom on the Zoom controls, it's called reactions, and in there's a hand raise icon. Okay, we have one hand raise icon right now.
Okay, why don't you call on the person, Jerry?
I forget.
Hi.
I forgot your name. I know you are.
Who's speaking?
it's is it
You have to unmute Ty Bell.
Ty Bell? Yeah, I know.
Well, is her Yiddish
I
name.
know someone else started to speak. It's a kind of a funny kind of question.
Go
And
ahead.
I'm not sure if it's for Moment or Jewish Study Center, but listening to this, I was reminded of someone I met through Farbrengen and Jewish Study Center, but she might have made Aliyah after you came, Amy. And we knew her as Haviva Krasner Davidson.
Oh, sure, I remember her. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I don't think it's for this column is, and she's someone I'm still in touch with, but she, even though Yeshiva University, the seminary, never answered her application, when she got to Israel, she eventually was ordained privately as an Orthodox rabbi. She uses rabbi. She also wrote a PhD in some Talmud thing. Well, she got a second ordination as an interfaith minister. That's the title she uses.
That's interesting.
She's got all sorts of stuff out on the Times of Israel blog. I mean, she's got her own Times of Israel blog. She has a recent novel. I don't know. It just seemed to me whether for Moment, because you could do Ask a Rabbi and she could do both the Jewish answer and the interfaith answer.
Okay, well, we've talked, not to just to move away from specific people. We've talked about doing various kinds of interfaith versions of this, and I would love to throw an imam in or two and stir them up, in a question, but you'd have to have the right question. So I saw another question I really want to answer, if people don't mind, on the chat. It's a short answer, but somebody asked about whether we've asked any questions about forgiveness or teshuvah, and there's one of the questions in here. Another of my favorites is, we did ask one Yom Kippur, are there sins that can't be forgiven? And I will say that all the rabbis had different ideas about what the sin is that can't be forgiven. So it's ranging from sort of Nazi crimes to children might not be able to forgive their parents for certain things. But I thought it was an interesting thing. So I scanned the chat while I had the chance there, and that was the question that came to mind.
Okay, and then you will have seen that people want to know if robots can be Jewish.
Robots, yes. Well, let's talk about robots. So I start, not only is this the title, I do start for the intro by saying, why in the world do we ask this silly question, and why would we name our book after it? And, first of all, you always like in the summer to ask something off and provocative and a little different. But it turns out there's a lot of talk about whether robots can be Jewish. You can Google it. There have been conferences on the subject. And when we asked the rabbis, some of them jumped right in. They wanted to talk about the golem, the Jewish robot, or the Jewish, artificially created being from antiquity and from, there's a 15th century version and so forth, which, as I said in the intro, may even have had some effect on Mary Shelley when she was writing Frankenstein. It may have been a legend she was familiar with. But we got a very fun range of answers. It turned out, the thing I had not known, it's like, again, you think it's a question about the nature of robots, and it turns out to be a question about the nature of rabbis, specifically that a lot of them were science fiction nerds growing up. particularly the more orthodox rabbis, seem to have been incredible geeks, because they leaped into this question. Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, the Sephardic rabbi, wrote a piece of pastiche about a rabbi named Are You Jew 418 or something. I guess it was 613, actually, now that I think of it. And you know, Are You Jew likes to, you know, he hates to wash his hands, even though he knows he has to say the bracha because then he's rusty and he has to use, you know, motor oil, you know, all this sort of silly stuff. And Yitz Greenberg had this dialogue with his robot in which they argue over whether the robot is Jewish. You know, oh, you know, you can't be. Can I arrange to have you circumcised? No, then you're not Jewish. Sure, I'm Jewish. I celebrated Hanukkah. No, Jews don't celebrate Hanukkah. That's Goyish. They observe Hanukkah. And the rabbi finally at the end starts guilting him, you know, and saying, are you ashamed to be holding out on me? You know, you spend all your time with your own grandchildren in Israel. You never call, you never write. So the rabbi says, oh, okay, I get it. You're Jewish. But in all seriousness, or in some seriousness, it was really a question. If you were to take it seriously, it's a question about, you know, to ask whether a robot can be Jewish, you have to ask what it means to be Jewish. Like, what does that mean? And then if being human is essential to being Jewish, then you have to ask, what is it? What makes us human? What is it about being human that's so special? And what is it about being Jewish that's so special? And this was a classic case. Some of the rabbis, I hate to say it because I myself was a science fiction geek growing up, and I think it makes sense because if you're interested in the big questions when you're younger, it's perfectly reasonable to end up in the rabbit. But so most of the male rabbis had no trouble with this question. They came down different places. The Orthodox rabbi Adlerstein said, no, a robot can't be Jewish because Yiddish and neshama, you know, either you have to be born of a Jewish mother or converted, and I don't know of any Jewish mother robots, and I myself sit on a conversion court, and I don't think we're converting any robots anytime soon, you know, like that. But some of the rabbis, 2 or 3 of them, called me up and they said the dreaded, you know, what? You know, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you want. And one of the rabbis said to me, I just don't know what I don't know where to start with this question. And so we talked about what makes people Jewish and what makes non-people Jewish and so forth. And she finally said, you know, I've sometimes had the feeling that my dog is Jewish. You know, my dog is crazy about Shabbat and so forth and so on. And you think I could do anything with that? And I said, oh, absolutely, go with that. And she wrote this perfectly beautiful meditation. And she found a midrash that says that to have a Yiddish neshama, a Jewish soul, all that's required is that you have been loved and cared for by Jews throughout your life. And so a child's beloved doll could be Jewish in that sense. And so why not the dog, you know? And she ended by saying, you know, we've always been a mixed multitude. There's always enough blessing to go around.
Oh, that's lovely.
I thought that was a lovely answer. And, you know, the one person, this is another thing, I could end on that note, but I also very much like the Reform rabbi, in this case, Rabbi Laura Novak Weiner, who's one of our regulars and is at Hebrew, has been in and out of, I think she's at Hebrew Union College. So she makes some jokes as needed. And then she went right to the core question, I thought. And she says, what really makes someone Jewish? It's more than cooking and eating the foods our families have passed down. It's even more than habitually enacting the mitzvot and rituals of our weekly, seasonal, and life cycles. To be Jewish is to be a partner with humanity and God in the never-ending pursuit of justice, peace, and perfection. To be Jewish is to turn inward, to have kavanah, or intentionality in behavior, to seek forgiveness and to forgive, to strive, to pray, and to act. To be Jewish is to be linked to Jews across time and space. If my robot could do all those things, then yes, I suppose it could be a Jewish robot. So I felt like she actually, that's the Reform rabbi, so she actually answered the question directly. I mean, that was really the question. So the golem, by the way, there's lots of Talmud about whether a golem can count in a minyan. So that's one way to get at it.
Let me ask this final question in terms of the outreach of this book and the wonderful perspectives that a reader gets on Jewish life and thinking. Have you had comments, responses, more questions from non-Jewish readers, non-Jewish clergy? Have the moment folks sent this out to perhaps theological schools of other denominations?
You know, we've done a little of it, but not nearly enough. I've been meaning to send it. I mean, we really wanted to set it up as this sort of civil dispute. You know, this is how you disagree, and you know, while maintaining common ground. This is one way. I mean, they don't actually argue with each other head to head, but obviously there's room. You know, there's room in this system for a lot of different views, and it doesn't have to be at the end of the world. So yes, I think we haven't done as much of that as we would like. I do remember many years ago, one of my sons was looking at the magazine in his college dorm room, and a Muslim friend of his came over and looked at the feature and said, "I don't think this would work with imams." But I don't know. I mean, I've always been tempted to think, well, wouldn't it be fun to try to do a spectrum like this in some other religion? I mean, we can't do it necessarily. I don't know how we would really go about it, but it's a I think the framework it's a good model. I'd like to think it's a good model. I hope so.
Well, Amy, you have been a delight and a probing interrogator of your own work for the past 75 minutes or so. And I wonder, Jerry, if there's anything else you'd like to add. We also need to post how people can get hold of the book.
Oh, did I? So I.
Well, in the email, well, first of all, this session has been recorded, and when the recording is posted, I'll send out an email telling people about it. In the email, I'll also give you a few different ways you can buy the book. You can buy the book from your local bookstore, or from Amazon, or from Moment Magazine directly. And I'll put some references in that email, so you'll see it. It's also in our website on the description of the class. There's some discussion about how to buy the book. So I think it's now time to just thank Amy for a great 75, 78 minutes, I guess. And also Mindy for asking the probing questions. A lot of the probing questions came from our audience, our really, should I use the word woke audience?
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I see a lot of friends, students, relatives on this. It's really lovely. Thank you.
It was a fun time. Again, I will send an email out sometime next few days when I have to get the recording out from Zoom, and I have to do a little editing, a couple of things to edit out, and then post it. It takes a while to do that, but you all will be informed.
And wait, we can't sign off without thanking Roz Timberg. It takes a number of people to pull this off. And Roz very kindly has given us her attention and served as we call a kind of a showmare, letting people in and just monitoring that all is going well technically. And thank you, Roz, very much.
Yes, thank you, Roz. And I do want to, obviously, we need the donations all the time. But I would also like to tell people that we have 2 more classes coming up at the end of this month. On Sunday, the 23rd, we have a very interesting class, which is kind of, to me, pretty weird. Interesting's weird, but the class topic is, it's about this museum, basically, which is a Holocaust memorial and a Holocaust education place and an art museum in Quito, Ecuador. And whoever heard of a Holocaust education facility in Quito, Ecuador? But there's some Jews there who have produced it, and it'll be a very interesting class. That's on Sunday, the 23rd. I think it's 2:00 in the afternoon. And then the following Wednesday, there's a class about the various things that the Association of Jewish Libraries do. So that'll be the following Wednesday. I think it's the 26th or 27th, whatever, Wednesday evening, about 3 weeks from now. So I hope to see all of you, or many of you, there. And again, thank you, Amy, for a very enlightening, but also enjoyable talk.
Thank you all.
That's it.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you,
you,
Jerry.
Amy.
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you,
Thanks,
Rob.
Amy. This was awesome.
I do hope,
Thanks a lot.
to say in the beginning of the next talk,
Throat.
all the violence in Israel. Hope everything will quiet down
Yes.
quickly.
Yes, let us wish peace for all,
Mm.
enduring peace.
Yeah.